Well, welcome to today's webinar for Startup Ignition. My name is John Richards, and we're going to have a brief webinar here that'll last around 30 minutes, and I want to thank you for participating and joining us today. Again, my name is John Richards, and I am CEO and co-founder of Startup Ignition, an entrepreneurship bootcamp. So today we're going to talk about how to set founding ownership percentages, but before we do that, we're going to take a look at one of the purposes of today's meeting, which is to inform you that we have an upcoming bootcamp cohort that's starting this week in Lehi, Utah. Our cohorts and boot camps are 3-day intensive in-class training followed by 3 months of unlimited mentoring. And it's going to be held at the training office of Jones Waldo, a venture law firm here in the state of Utah and located with their office in Lehi. So with that, we encourage you to apply. There's no obligation to apply, and go to startupignition.com and apply for participation, and you get a 15-minute interview with myself, and also we discuss your thoughts and ideas around entrepreneurship and see if there's a good fit. With that, today's agenda is for me to get a little street cred with you, talk about Startup Ignition and what it is, and most of the time will be spent on our topic, how to set founding ownership percentages. First of all, a little bit about myself. All of the instructors in Startup Ignition are been there, done it folks. My experience is in the realm of entrepreneurship, investing, education, and mentorship all around the field of entrepreneurship. As an entrepreneur, I've launched many companies. I've had a number of good exits. My claim to fame in the entrepreneur world is I was in the Yellow Pages industry and was the first person to put Yellow Pages on the internet in the late 90s, and the company InfoSpace went public, and I've had the experience as an investor of investing in over 85 in different companies. Some of them, such as Omniture, also have gone public, and it's been exciting to be on the investment side and seeing companies go public. So you can see some of the lists on the screen now of companies that I have invested in. I have about 25 current investments going right now. I'm also an educator. For 12 years, I taught in the BYU Marriott School of Management in entrepreneurship and helped run the Entrepreneurship Center and taught many beginning, introduction, and advanced courses in entrepreneurship. I've literally taught and mentored thousands of entrepreneurial students and entrepreneurs. Also have helped out at other universities and across the globe, taught hundreds of lectures and classes. And Startup Ignition is my latest effort in the field of education and entrepreneurship. I'm also a mentor that I was a founder of Boom Startup and sold my half to my partner back in 2013 when I joined Google for a couple of years, and also have been managing partner of Utah Angels, which for over a decade was the only and largest angel group in the state of Utah. So that's my background. Startup Ignition is literally based on been there, done it instruction based on real experience. These are some of my recent current investments of companies, most of them in the state of Utah, and ones that I'm hoping do really well. Just to show you, I have many more I could show you that have failed. Just like in entrepreneurship and investing, we don't win at everything we do. We learn by our mistakes and what we've done on how to do things right. The good news is that we've learned a lot and codified a lot of steps in entrepreneurship to make it very teachable. Startup Ignition, again, is an entrepreneurship bootcamp. It is a short-term intensive skills training bootcamp where 4 years of university type of education we can condense down into about 3 months or less to really deliver intensive, high-impact skills training. Entrepreneurship is a skill-based endeavor. You don't have to be born an entrepreneur. You can actually be trained and taught how to pursue entrepreneurship. The ideal candidates for this bootcamp are those that want to start a company, those that are in the midst of starting a company, and those that maybe started a company and need some help. We also have an interesting outcome since we started about 3 years ago that a lot of people that take Startup Ignition, and I shouldn't say a lot, but a number of them discover that entrepreneurship's not for them and that they maybe would be better at being a great employee for a company, and they land great and better jobs than they had before. That's an unintended consequence, but it's an interesting offshoot. The Startup Ignition model is based on the concept that startups need to do the right things in the right order. premature scaling is the great sin of entrepreneurship and a violation of the lean startup model. And that is often doing the right things, but just in the wrong order. So when we look at the cycles, or excuse me, the steps or phases of a business in a full entrepreneurial cycle, we look at discovery, validation, efficiency, scale, sustain, and renewal. What we do and focus on in the Nail Express curriculum is the discovery and validation phase. It's very, very common for entrepreneurs not to understand how important it is to exercise discovery and validation and fully get to a validated business model before they start to scale a business. And often there's an unknown step called the efficiency phase, which is skipped altogether as well. And this is what causes so much pain and agony when companies try to scale prematurely. And in Startup Ignition, we take you through a curriculum developed over a dozen years to get you to the point of doing it properly in the right order. We have a very detailed curriculum with a lot of knowledge and information in it. And the key point is that the crowning end result should be a validated business model so that you can work on the systems to get you ready to fully scale. We have instructors in this cohort will be myself and Gary Rhodes. Gary Rhodes is an award-winning professor of entrepreneurial marketing. He was at the forefront of figuring out from a marketing aspect lean startup, and he has contributed greatly to the curriculum and concepts of Startup Ignition. Also Tyler Richards, who is my co-founder and my son. He's the founder of Dev Mountain, and he shares some of his experiences in the cohort as well. We have many other subject matter experts and mentors that you will be linked to as a participant in Startup Ignition. The upcoming cohort is this Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, February 28th, March 1st, March 2nd, 3 full jam-packed days of over 24 hours of instruction, and it'll be held at the Jones Waldo Venture Law office in Lehi, Utah. Please go to startupignition.com and apply. This is the building where it's held up in Lehi. And the tuition is $19.99. We have discounts for women entrepreneurs and also multi-participants from the same startup company. So please check that out and email us. But the best thing to do is just apply so that we can have a good conversation to see if it's a good fit. Bottom line on Startup Ignition, it's about what's under the hood that makes a great car. It's not just the fancy look on the outside looking like a great car. It's actually what's inside and how things are put together and how the engine runs. And that's at Startup Ignition, and why we chose our name is because we really focus on what's under the hood and make sure that the ignition's working and the engine is purring in your entrepreneurial venture. With that, the value of participating, again, knowledge, mentorship, networking, and peer-to-peer interactions. Don't discount the importance of having frequent communications with peer-to-peer, with peers that are pursuing entrepreneurial ventures, perhaps a few months ahead of you in what you're pursuing. It really is valuable, and we create an environment for that. So again, Startup Ignition, the good news is entrepreneurship can be taught, and it can be done in a boot camp format like Startup Ignition. We're well in past 3 years into this with hundreds of participants. Now, with that, let's move into today's topic, how to set founding ownership percentages. Nowhere in the field of entrepreneurship is there more landmines than in figuring out how to work with co-founders and setting up ownership percentages and making sure that people understand what's going on and are happy with what has been done. Matter of fact, most of the litigation in entrepreneurship has to do with founder-to-founder litigation. We can really avoid a lot of these problems by focusing on prevention instead of the cure. If we just set up our documents and understand how to do this right, we can avoid most of the pain that can happen in founder relations and in understanding how companies are owned. So with that, in Startup Ignition, we go through methodically and in detail how to understand capitalization tables and the capitalization of a new venture. So when we start a company, we start it with founders that will, in a lot of ways, will pull out of a hat their ownership percentages. And in taking a look at this, I have an example here with Fred and Wilma that decided to go 50-50. Now, in looking at this, there's a real problem with 50-50. Matter of fact, it's said that the only wrong answer with 50-50 is that it is the only wrong answer. That in an entrepreneurial venture, when we're deciding who's going to own what at the start, just saying 50-50 causes untold myriad problems. At any one time, of all of the many people that I'm mentoring, I'll have about 7 or 8 founding teams that were set up in a 50-50 structure and are having major problems. This is a real issue in the entrepreneurial world, and we need to avoid it at all costs. So what looks better? What would make more sense? Well, you can't just do this and say, okay, we're 4 of us and we're each going to have 25%. This is a common scenario at universities. Many startups that begin in a university class will have 4 team members, and they'll decide just to go 25, 25, 25, 25. A few months later, when they get their first $1 million a year customer or they get their first investor interested, a lot of problems start to materialize. And in looking at this, it's still a 50-50. So we don't want to do that either. So what we like to say is that in a startup, we need a benevolent dictatorship. It's not to be run by a democracy or a committee. Now, that might be foreign to some people in concept and think, well, I want to be in a company where it's fair and we're running with good group decisions. That actually really holds back the company and makes it uninvestable to sophisticated investors. They want to see someone who's got leadership and is in charge and makes a final decision. And there's problems when we don't set up our structures properly in that way. So I want to stop here and just emphasize that this is a very serious topic. Lots of pain and agony, and family relationships and good friendships have been destroyed by setting things up wrong at the beginning of a venture. And it's interesting, the problems actually arise when the venture has success. If there's no success, these problems don't manifest themselves in the same way. But when the company starts to take off with investor interest or customer interest, you'll see that we'll have a lot of problems with founders that are set up in these type of structures. Now, this is a much better structure. If you look at the screen and look at the 4 founders here, Fred, Wilma, Barney, and Betty, we're seeing that Fred, the main founder, maybe whose idea it was, going to be the founding CEO, he's at 65, Wilma's at 25, and Barney's at 5, and Betty's at 5. This is a much more normal structure that is much more comfortable to investors and to those that are familiar with how these things should work. And that's because we're looking, we know who the person is in charge, who's going to make the final call and is in control of the company. This is a much more comfortable situation and leads to faster and better products and development of the company. Now, there's still a problem, even though there's no 50-50 problem. And what is the problem? Well, first of all, we ask ourselves, how did we arrive at these numbers? How do we decide who got what percentage? And that can be a problem. That can be an issue. How do we do that? Well, most of the time, it's just the wild, wild west. We have negotiation to fix numbers, and we come up with what makes sense on day one of the entity or actually getting serious about the business, and we don't put much more thought than that into it, and it can really cause problems later down the road. So is there a better way than just pulling these numbers out of the hat with what we assume will be the contribution level of each of the founders? There actually is. This is a quote by Steve Blank.
So one of the things we now know is that a startup isn't a smaller version of a large company. It took us decades to get down to a simple definition. A startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. Now, these couple of sentences are fraught with meaning. A startup is a temporary organization. What does that mean?
Indeed. A startup is a temporary organization. This is Steve Blank, the father of the Lean Startup Movement and the author of the book, The Startup Owner's Manual, which is one of the Bibles we use in Startup Ignition. And he's saying that a startup is a temporary organization, and the purpose of that organization is to find a repeatable and sustainable business model. That's an important concept, and it leads to the solution of how we can think about founding ownership. So I'd like to introduce to you a concept called slicing pie. Slicingpie.com, you can go there and read more about it. It's also a book called Slicing Pie. And this concept emerged about 8 years ago as a way to overcome the problem of how silly it is to set the founding ownerships on day one with a fixed amount, not understanding the contribution levels of the parties, and then months later having the contribution levels not match the actual percentages that were awarded on day one. And that's a problem, because a temporary organization means that if we have static and fixed ownership percentages, and then we're taking a look at that, that's a problem. Is there a way to dynamically assign these percentages based on consistent contribution levels? Well, there happens to be a solution, and that solution is something that is perfectly fair, rewards participants for contributions, provides ongoing motivation and continuing contributing in the organization, accommodates changes in the team if someone leaves and if someone joins, and it's flexible in the face of rapid change during this startup phase. And the answer is dynamic equity split, which is captured in the book Slicing Pie. Dynamic equity split means something very simple. If you contribute 50%, you get 50%. If you contribute 10%, you get 10%. If you contribute 23.2%, you get 23.2%. No more and no less. The problem with fixed equity split is that if your share percentage is greater than the value of your contribution, there's going to be resentment in the team, and it's going to rear its ugly head. Also, likewise, if your share percentage is less than the value of your contribution, you're going to resent it, and you're going to be upset with the rest of the team members. This is a very common occurrence in startup organizations, and it can be overcome with the concepts of slicing pie. Slicing Pie's allocation framework was quite simple. You assign a proxy value to the various inputs provided by each participant. We call those slices. Your share percentage is then your slices divided by the total slices. And it self-adjusts over time. It's dynamic. This is what's detailed in the book Slicing Pie. Again, you can go to slicingpie.com and read all about this. When you're looking at this, there's ways of tracking this. We take your inputs like the time you're contributing, the cash you've contributed, the equipment and supplies you've contributed, facilities you may have contributed, intellectual property, commissions that you might have earned but are not being paid during this startup phase of testing sales and doing different things. It's interesting to look at these inputs and track them and see what the real contributions of each of the participants is. There's SaaS software now developed around this to help companies track it. The concept is this concept can be used in certain ways, like whether you were friends and family funded by a rich uncle, whether you're going to subject all of the equity to this, or my favorite, which is partially. Maybe we say we're going to fix some of the equity, but we don't know how to allocate the final 40%. So 60% will be fixed, but let's see how we do over the next 6 months, 9 months, a year in working on the startup, and then allocate the rest of the percentage amongst the founders based on how they contribute. At some point, usually when you take in money from an external investor or you start having serious customer activity, you can freeze where you're at and set the percentages based on that. Again, I'm not here to teach you all about slicing pie today, but it's one of the only solutions I've found in the last decade that really addresses this problem of how to truly figure out what percentage each of the founders should get. And a lot of teams that I know now have followed this, and it's helped. Even Startup Ignition itself used this in order to discover the contribution levels of secondary and tertiary founders, and we adjusted based on what we discovered over time. And because we built in the concepts of slicing pie into our founding documents, we were able to make adjustments and keep everyone happy. So using it partially or whatever works for you is highly encouraged. So the question comes up then, are there any more problems on allocating these percentages? Well, I'm going to kind of segue into one major issue I like to bring up when I'm talking about ownership percentages. There are some problems. What if one terminates early? This is a big problem in startup entrepreneurship. For instance, let's take the example of Wilma. Wilma received 25% under the scenario you'll see on your screen. Wilma at 25%, she actually is not contributing that much. We're finding out that Betty at 5% is doing 3 times the contribution level of Wilma. What do we do? What happens? How do we handle and address that problem? It's really, really important in this scenario, even if you're doing fixed equity, so I'm not talking about slicing pie at this time, that you have founder vesting in your company. So founder vesting is the concept that founders, once they start a company and they have their ownership percentage and their shares or units in an LLC, that they subject that ownership to a contract where they vest over time to get the stock back. So they become owners and founders, and then they subject their ownership to a vesting schedule. This protects one founder from the other. In this case, this would protect Fred and Barney and Betty if Wilma quit, let's say 120 days into the venture. If she quit having received on day one 25%, that would be catastrophic to this startup. But with founder vesting, the company would receive all of the 25% ownership back because Wilma quit and left. And founder vesting is the contractual mechanism to make that happen. It's called founder vesting. It's a very common thing in the entrepreneurial world, but people that tend to do their own paperwork and legal work to start up companies don't put this in, and then they get into problems when founders terminate early or leave the company early. Now, founder vesting is a very important topic, and I always like to mention when we're talking about founder vesting, if you do use the concept of founder vesting on the ownership in a company, you're going to make your stock or your equity restricted. And restricted stock has certain tax consequences that you have to be careful with. So there's a thing, and I don't have a slide on it today, but you're going to want to jot this down. Rule 83B. You want to make a Rule 83B election with the IRS if you use founder vesting. Bottom line here, every new startup should have founder vesting amongst its founders. This protects all founders from one another. If you use founder vesting, you have created restricted equity or restricted stock, and you need to exercise a Rule 83B election and file it with the IRS. You can go online and find out how to do that. We talk about this in Startup Ignition. But Rule 83B also must be done within the first 30 days of the formation of the entity, the receipt of the stock from the founders. If you do not do it within 30 days, you will create a pretty horrific tax consequence to the founders. That's very important. Now, with that said, and we're coming down to only having about 4 minutes left, I've concluded with talking about some of the concepts around how to establish ownership percentages in a company, the concept of slicing pie, founder vesting. So if you have any questions, feel free to chat those and put those in the chat right now, and we can take a look if there are any. I'm just going to fill a couple minutes here while I'm waiting for any questions to come in, that you're invited to apply to Startup Ignition at startupignition.com and participate. I have 5 seats left in the cohort, and I'd love to see some of you apply for that. And we're going to have a fun time starting this Thursday with 3 intensive days together. Also, you can reach me at any time at jrichards@startupignition.com with any of your entrepreneurial questions. I'll be happy to answer some questions that you have. And I look forward to having some of you participate. If there's any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can write it up in the chat in the couple minutes we have left. I'll give a 10-15 seconds to see if any come in. While I'm waiting for that, I also want to apologize for the drop-off in the Zoom account where it cut us off, so I apologize for that very much. And that's the first time that's happened to me in these webinars, but hopefully in the future that won't happen again for me. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions, so I hope you got a little flavor and taste today for Startup Ignition and the detail that we're going to do. Oh, sure. Who is this?
So this is Barney, but you have a few questions in the Zoom group chat.
Oh, I was looking at it. Let me see. Where am I not seeing the Zoom group chat? I don't know where. Oh, there we are. You actually do. So apologize for that. Thought I was looking in there. I see that there's.
Starts with Y.
Yeah, I see that. I see that. So thank you. We've got a couple minutes, so let's take that. Okay, here. Count up for the meeting. Zoom pushed it up. All right. Why Skull Candy? Why did I invest in Skull Candy? Skull Candy I invested in because it was a rocket ship. I didn't get it at first. With Rick Alden was the founder. He came to us, offered us a valuation of $3 million. We passed on it. I later bought in at a $70 million valuation, and it went to over $1 billion. So that's why I invested in it, because Rick Alden is kind of a marketing genius, and he took $2 headphones or earbuds from China and sold them for up to $100 through marketing. So that's why I invested in that. Does the big freeze need to happen before revenue is received? It doesn't have to happen before revenue is received, but it does have to happen at when you take an investment that affects the capitalization of the company. So it doesn't have to happen when revenue is received, but it does have to happen when you start taking an investment from outside investors. Hopefully that answers the question. The ideal number of founders is somewhere 2 to 5. 5's getting a little heavy. I would not like to see a company with 6 founders. 2, where one's strong in tech and one's strong in business, whatever the tech of the company is, that's a great team. For really scalable ventures that are multi-sided, we talk a lot about multi-sided, multi-actor models. If your business model is a one-actor model, where like a B2B SaaS company where you're just selling to a business customer, 2 founders would be fine. If you're doing a 3-sided market where you've got 1 customer and 2 free users, and you've got to really validate all those markets, having 3-4 founders is ideal, because you're going to need that even in the startup phase. Hardware, software startup. What do you start with? Again, hardware are the most complicated type of businesses, just to let you know. Software is actually easier. And then you're saying, really? Is that true? Yeah. Some of the electronic hardware that needs software, such as firmware or application software, mobile and web, and then you also have to deal with injection molding and circuit boards and electrical engineering. Those are highly complex companies, and you need multiple founders to pull those companies off. Very, very hard to do with one person. If you do it with too few of founders, you'll find that you'll really elongate the process of getting to marketing and getting to revenue. So hopefully I'm answering that. Let's see one more from Ryan. By the way, Ryan, always appreciate you. With Slicing Pie, you can end up with co-founders owning 50-50 or very close. Investors like to see a clear founder that is controlling. How do you protect that with Slicing Pie? Well, my favorite way to do it is there's usually one person who's the main idea and the main driver in a company, and I'd like to see them get a fixed equity piece up front. For instance, let's say 40%, and then take the other 60% and dole that out based on distribution levels that you figure out with Slicing Pie. So that main founder may end up with 55-60%, and the other 2 are dividing up 40-45%. Hopefully, Ryan, that answers what you're saying. I don't like straight slicing pie sometimes, because of what you've brought up, that you could end up at 50-50. But really, when you have 3 or 4 founders, Slicing Pie really helps you identify who's really contributing. Slicing Pie does not discuss the 83B election rule. That's actually a great question from Mike. And there is some questions from attorneys and accountants about Slicing Pie. And many accountants and attorneys don't like or don't understand Slicing Pie yet. It's fairly new. It's only about 8 years old. Startup Ignition has 3 venture firms that have been trained on Slicing Pie and know how to bake it into your model of formation of the company. So you want to have an attorney that understands it. And so when you actually receive the equity, and it's yours, is you have 30 days to do a Rule 83B election. But there are some nuances with Slicing Pie that you need to look at and make sure that you get competent help. I'll just say this to everybody, even though I've gone a minute or 2 over because of the drop off of Zoom: never, ever do your own legal work in forming a company. That's very dangerous to do. I don't like spending money with attorneys, just like no one likes that. But this is not a place to do it yourself. There's way too many important issues that have to be done right, especially for scalable ventures, that you don't want to mess up on. So with that. Last question, Wes. Slice Pie seems great, both in application. It seems like it would get cumbersome. How do you make it easy to manage? It's really quite easy. You once a week enter data into a spreadsheet that you're all collecting, and it automatically calculates out, and it's running calculation. I've used it myself. It works really well. I've never used their SaaS software. I've just used the free spreadsheet that you can download from the site, and it's worked really well. It's actually not that hard to do, and it's really customizable because you can take the inputs. The default input is that your time or your cash that you put in gets 4 units. your time value is double units, and facilities, intellectual property, and equipment is done at a 1x dollar value. So if you put in $20,000 with equipment, you get 20,000 units. If you put in $20,000 worth of free time, you would get 40,000 units. If you put in 20,000 hard dollars, you would get 80,000 units. And so there's a way to establish different values. The spreadsheet is located at slicingpie.com, and you can download it from there. That was the last question. Hey, thanks for your questions. My name is John Richards. Startup Ignition is the boot camp, and I've gone over, so I'm going to have to shut it down now, but feel free to email me with any questions. And I want to thank you for participating. Thank you, everyone, for being on with us today. We sure appreciate it.